Indian, John Brown had a little Indian. John Brown had a little Indian, one little Indian boy.
It was called St. Anne's, funded by the government and for decades administered by the Catholic orders of the Oblates and the Grey Nuns. Generations of children from remote James Bay communities were forced to attend the school. Running away was not uncommon.
The OPP documents from the investigations into St. Anne's.
Barrera had covered the survivors' court fight to get the documents, but even he had no idea of the darkness they contained.
Every single page almost in these documents was just an itemization of abuse and torture alleged by the people the OPP interviewed, and it was incredible. There's no respite from the darkness until you close it at the end.
What the documents confirm is what St. Anne survivors had claimed and been told there was no evidence to prove. That electric chair, it existed. There's even a diagram.
So this one has vomit.
The forced eating of vomit, there were dozens of accounts. Physical abuse was common at the school. A one-time principal, who later became bishop, was reported to have beaten a student unconscious with a whip. And then there was the sexual abuse that the government's official summary of St. Anne's concluded had never happened. According to the police documents, it was rampant. Children sexually assaulted by nuns, by priests, by school employees, and sometimes by each other.
Bureaucrats like Duncan Campbell Scott championed assimilation as the solution to making Indigenous peoples, quote-unquote, fit into colonial society. In other words, to get rid of the Indian problem, and Indigenous children were viewed as the method. More than 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to residential schools.
We were going to visit my grandmother one day, a nice July day, back in 1955. There was 4 of us and 1 girl, my sister. And we came over that little rise over there, and we were heading there down here, and a black car pulled alongside of us, and we didn't know who it was at the time. The driver said, "Would you like a ride there?" We said no, we didn't know who they were. We kept on walking, and they kept pace with us in their car, and they kept trying to get us to get in, and we refused for a couple hundred yards that way, and they offered us some ice cream and jello at a restaurant in Thamesville. And I had ice cream. After we finished, we all loaded back up into the car, but they never went back the way they came. They went around away from the reserve. I fell asleep, and I never woke up until we were coming up to the Mohawk Institute. But after I got old enough, I realized I was kidnapped. Like I said, my dad didn't know the Department of Indian Affairs.
Children learn traditions and pass them on. But students at these schools were forbidden from practicing their culture and speaking their language. On top of that, many were physically and sexually abused and forced to live in unsanitary living conditions. And so many children died in these schools that by the 1920s, the federal government just stopped recording the number of deaths and started using unmarked graves. These schools existed for about 130 years, and the last residential school didn't close until 1996. But around the 1930s, the federal government started to realize that residential schools weren't actually meeting its assimilationist goals and became increasingly more expensive to operate. But the Indian problem still persisted. So around the 1940s, residential schools started to be used as orphanages and child welfare facilities instead. By the 1960s, a new policy was enacted that became known as the 60s Scoop. More than 20,000 First Nations children were taken from their homes and placed with non-Indigenous families. Now, this is Canada's history, sure, but it's far from staying in the past. This is a crisis that is still ongoing, now through foster care. Children who end up in the child welfare system often go to non-Indigenous caregivers. As a result, many grow up not knowing their culture, language, or clan. It ends up having a very similar effect to what was being done through residential schools and the 60s scoop. Even worse, it breaks up families for years. Tamara Malcolm is a mother from Manitoba who has been fighting to get her 3 sons out of the system since 2007. One of them has since aged out of foster care. The main reason this crisis is persisting is the federal government underfunds child welfare, health, and social services on reserve. MP Charlie Angus brought this up during question period after the census was released.
The documents show that federal programs are so underfunded that Indigenous parents actually have to give their children away to provincial foster care in order to get help. There's something fundamentally wrong.
And the federal government has been aware of this issue for quite some time. The Auditor General reported in 2008 that the funding for First Nations communities was inequitable. The government sets the budget for child welfare services. INAC oversees Indigenous affairs, and individual agencies are tasked by INAC to deliver the services across the country. The government has used the same formula since 1988 to fund services for reserves. It operates on budget reallocations. So, when new services are needed, like child welfare programs, instead of increasing the budget, money is pulled from crucial services like housing and infrastructure. But all of these are inherently linked to the quality of a child's life. Failing to fund all of them sufficiently only creates a toxic cycle where poverty and poor housing become key drivers for children placed in foster care. But there's a catch. These agencies that are meant to provide child services to Indigenous children are barely able to operate because the funding is so low, let alone provide prevention services. Meanwhile, if children are placed in foster care, costs to keep them there are reimbursed by INAC. Basically, INAC is giving these agencies an incentive to choose foster care as the solution, when the problem is really a lack of funding. This has been confirmed by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. In 2007, the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada and the AFN filed a human rights complaint against the government, which the federal government spent $707,000 in legal fees fighting.
The most shocking thing about this whole case has been that we had to file it at all. Why did we have to take the Canadian government to court to get them to treat little kids fairly? Like, these are little kids. Shouldn't any moral government do that as a matter of course? And why did they fight us so hard? I still don't, and why are they continuing to fight it so